If you were sick in ancient Egypt, you didn't just go see a doctor. You went to see someone who could speak to the gods, bargain with demons, and maybe rub a few herbs on your wound while muttering a spell. Because in Egypt, medicine wasn't just medicine, it was half science, half magic, and sometimes 90% performance art. To the Egyptians, illness wasn't caused by germs, parasites, or the fact that you'd eaten bread full of sand. No, sickness came from forces far scarier. Angry gods, wandering spirits, or even curses flung your way by enemies. If you tripped and broke your arm, maybe you should have walked slower. But if you developed a fever, clearly you had offended the gods, or worse, someone had hexed you. This made healers in Egypt very different from your modern family doctor. Instead of white coats and stethoscopes, they often wore priestly robes. Their medical kit wasn't just bandages and ointments. It was also a collection of sacred scrolls, amulets, and a well-practiced glare that said, "Don't worry, I can definitely banish that demon living in your spleen." Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight we will explore the topic why ancient Egyptian medicine was stranger than you think, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. When Egyptians got sick, doctors, or more accurately, priest healers, wouldn't just treat the body, they treated the soul. Remedies often came with a mandatory chant or spell. For example, if you had a snake bite, the healer might mix herbs for the wound, but also recite an incantation that called upon Isis, the goddess who knew all about poison and healing. Because why not double your chances? Worst case, the herbs work. Best case, the herbs and a goddess get involved. And these weren't quick spells either. Some incantations went on for dozens of lines, invoking gods, recounting myths, and threatening spirits with eternal torment if they didn't leave the patient's body immediately. Imagine being on your deathbed and your healer says, "Don't worry, I'll cure you," then proceeds to read something longer than the terms and conditions on a software update. The biggest reason religion and medicine blended so tightly is because Egyptians believed their entire world was run by divine order. Health wasn't just about eating your vegetables and avoiding plague-infested rivers. It was about living in harmony with Mawat, the cosmic balance. If you got sick, it meant something in the grand spiritual system was out of whack. That's why many healers were priests. They had access to temple knowledge, scrolls of secret wisdom, and connections to the gods. Being healed wasn't just a matter of getting patched up. It was a divine favor. If you survived, you didn't just thank your doctor, you thanked Raja, Isis, or Thoth for signing off on your survival. One of the most popular prescriptions wasn't a potion or a poultice, but jewelry. Egyptians wore amulets shaped like scarabs, ankhs, or the Eye of Horus to ward off illness. Each one had a protective purpose. A scarab amulet might keep your heart safe, while an Eye of Horus was practically the ancient version of health insurance. You could be walking around covered in charms, jangling like a one-man percussion section, all to stop demons from giving you food poisoning. And if someone asked what was wrong, you'd just say, "Oh, my liver feels funny, so I'm wearing this crocodile-shaped necklace until it goes away." Today that sounds ridiculous. But really, are we so different? People still wear Lucky Charms, healing crystals, and bracelets that supposedly balance your energy. The only difference is the Egyptians looked cooler doing it. They had amulets inlaid with gold. Of course, if protective magic existed, so did dangerous magic. Egyptians were convinced that curses could cause illness, and healers often diagnosed patients by asking, "So, who cursed you?" Imagine sitting in a clinic today and hearing, "Your MRI is fine, but clearly your neighbor hexed you after you borrowed his donkey without asking." Sometimes, treatments included counter-curses, basically magical lawsuits against invisible enemies. A healer might write the curse on a piece of papyrus, then burn it, dissolve it in water, or even smear it on the patient, because nothing says modern healthcare like drinking your enemy's curse in tea form. If you walked into an Egyptian clinic and asked for help, your prescription might sound like this: "Take this mixture of honey and herbs. Wear 3 amulets blessed by Horus, and recite the following prayer every time you sneeze. Imagine getting that on a prescription slip at Walgreens. It's easy to laugh now, but to Egyptians this was logical. Medicine wasn't about choosing between science and superstition. To them, it was all part of the same system. Herbs and spells worked together, like antibiotics and Tylenol. Except instead of Tylenol, it was probably a goat's hoof. So yes, in ancient Egypt, the doctor really would curse you now, or bless you, depending on how you looked at it. Illness wasn't just about biology, it was a cosmic battle between good and evil, gods and demons. And your healer's job wasn't only to treat your symptoms, but to restore balance in the universe. The next time you think your doctor's handwriting is bad, be grateful it doesn't read. Step 1. Appease the gods. Step 2. Wear a necklace shaped like a dung beetle. Step 3. Drink this potion and hope it's not just lizard blood. In short, Egyptian medicine was less take 2 aspirin and more take 2 prayers and call me in the morning. If you've ever had a strange rash and thought, I'll just search it up, only to be convinced you'll be dead by tomorrow afternoon, then congratulations, you already understand the ancient Egyptian approach to medicine, except they didn't have Google, they had papyrus scrolls, which were basically giant ancient search engines, except slower, harder to update, and written in hieroglyphs. These scrolls were not dusty old decorations, they were the closest thing ancient Egypt had to a medical textbook. The most famous ones we know today, the Ebers papyrus, the Edwin Smith papyrus, and the Kahun papyrus, give us a front row seat to how Egyptians thought about health, disease, and what counted as a cure. Spoiler, sometimes it was practical, sometimes it was magical, and sometimes it sounded like a prank gone too far. The Ebers papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, is the heavyweight champion of Egyptian medical texts. It's enormous, stretching over 100 feet when rolled out, with more than 800 remedies neatly written down. If you ever wanted a complete list of things Egyptians thought were worth smearing on your body, this was it. Remedies included herbs, minerals, animal products, and things best left unnamed if you're eating dinner. One entry recommends using honey to clean wounds. Smart, since honey is antibacterial. Another suggests crocodile dung as birth control. Less smart, unless the goal was to never be in the mood again. Meanwhile, the Edwin Smith papyrus, named after the man who purchased it, not some ancient Egyptian called Edwin, is strikingly different. While most papyri bounce between spells and recipes, this one is surprisingly clinical. It deals with surgical trauma, broken bones, wounds, head injuries. Instead of praying to the gods or telling patients to wear an amulet, it offers observations, diagnoses, and rational treatments. In fact, it's sometimes called the earliest known surgical manual in history. Imagine living in a world where almost everyone thinks illness comes from curses, and then one guy writes, "Actually, this skull fracture is from blunt force trauma, and here's how you can treat it." That's like finding a modern doctor in a time machine. Then there's the Kahun papyrus, which focused on gynecology. Dating back to around 1800 BCE, it's full of instructions on fertility, contraception, pregnancy tests, and women's diseases. Some advice was surprisingly effective, like using barley and wheat to detect pregnancy, while other treatments included mixtures of milk, honey, and animal fat in ways that don't exactly scream doctor approved. Reading it today, you can almost hear the ancient women muttering, "Really? You want me to put what where?" What's fascinating is how these texts combine two very different worlds, practical medicine and magical thinking. One page might suggest applying moldy bread to a wound, which actually works as a primitive antibiotic, while the next tells you to chant a spell to banish evil spirits. It's as if every remedy came with a backup plan. If the science didn't help, maybe the magic would, or maybe both together would give you a fighting chance. In many ways, the papyri were like the world's first self-help medical blogs. They weren't just dry instructions for doctors, they were guides for anyone who could read them, filled with advice on how to fix everything from toothaches to belly pain. Today's wellness influencers might tell you to sip celery juice for detox. Ancient Egyptian papyri might say, Take honey, rub it on your body, and don't forget to mutter a quick prayer to Horus while you're at it. Same energy, just a bit more crocodile dung. What makes these scrolls even more impressive is their sheer ambition. They didn't just focus on one illness. They tried to cover everything: eye problems, digestive issues, hair loss, parasites, wounds, burns, infections, reproductive health. Imagine trying to cram the knowledge of an entire civilization's medical practice onto a few rolls of papyrus. The result was a bizarre mix of genius and nonsense that tells us as much about Egyptian society as it does about their health. And there's a kind of strange honesty to them. Some cases in the Edwin Smith papyrus end with the phrase, "an ailment not to be treated." That's ancient Egyptian for, "Yeah, you're not walking this one off." Instead of offering false hope, they admitted when a condition was beyond help. In a world where most people thought gods controlled life and death, this sort of blunt medical realism is shockingly refreshing. The papyri also reveal just how creative Egyptians were in experimenting with the world around them. They tried everything: herbs, minerals, animal products, even human materials. Some of it worked, some of it didn't, but the effort shows they were constantly searching, testing, and writing things down. That's what makes these texts so important. They weren't random guesses passed around orally. They were systematic attempts to record knowledge for the future. Of course, if you were a patient back then, you probably didn't care if your treatment came from a carefully documented scroll or the healer's imagination. You just wanted to stop coughing up blood or get rid of that headache. Still, it's comforting to know that even thousands of years ago, humans were obsessed with writing down their medical wisdom. And just like our internet searches today, half the time it was brilliant, and half the time it made you go, wait, they recommended what? So if the last part showed us that Egyptian medicine was tangled up with priests and spells, these papyri reveal the other side, the desperate practical attempt to record actual medical knowledge. They may look strange to us now, but they were the ancient world's attempt to organize chaos. Instead of Googling your symptoms at 2 a.m., you'd consult a papyrus scroll by lamplight. And instead of panicking that you had every disease known to man, you might simply be told, rub honey on it, and try not to annoy the gods. If you think going to the dentist today is bad, imagine lying on a mat in ancient Egypt while someone prepares to cut you open with a sharpened piece of bronze. And the only thing standing between you and agony is your ability to bite down on your own arm. Surgery in ancient Egypt was not for the faint of heart. In fact, it might have been the world's first true test of human endurance. Forget running marathons, surviving surgery was the real extreme sport. The Egyptians, to their credit, were surprisingly skilled with the tools they had. Archaeological evidence and written accounts suggest they could stitch wounds, set broken bones, lance abscesses, and even perform some basic surgical interventions like removing cysts or draining fluids. They weren't just poking around blindly. They had an astonishingly good understanding of anatomy, thanks in large part to the somewhat morbid practice of mummification. When you spend a few thousand years carefully removing organs from bodies, you can't help but pick up a few pointers about what goes where. But here's the catch. They had no anesthesia. None. Zero. The best you might get was a swig of beer or some herbal concoction to take the edge off. But that's like trying to use a juice box to numb the pain of a car crash. For most patients, pain management consisted of clenching every muscle in your body, praying to whichever god you thought was listening, and hoping you didn't pass out before the surgeon was finished. Passing out, of course, was the closest thing they had to anesthesia, which technically makes fainting the unsung hero of early medicine. Now, you might be wondering why anyone would agree to this. Well, if your leg was broken, your choices were simple: crawl around in misery for the rest of your life, or let an Egyptian doctor yank it back into place and tie it up with splints. And remarkably, the evidence shows that many of these patients actually healed. Mummified remains reveal broken bones that had been neatly reset, sometimes even fused back together almost as well as modern orthopedics could manage. It wasn't always pretty, but it worked. Surgical stitching is another fascinating area. Egyptians used needles and thread made from plant fibers or animal sinew to close wounds. This was not delicate embroidery, it was practical. fast, and designed to keep you from bleeding out. Imagine lying there, clutching a stick in your teeth while someone sews you up like a leather sandal. Romantic? No. Effective? Surprisingly, yes. Some mummies show scars from well-healed wounds, suggesting their patients lived long after the surgeon packed up his kit. And speaking of surgical kits, the tools themselves were both ingenious and terrifying. Archaeologists have uncovered scalpels made from copper or bronze, sharp flint knives, hooks, forceps, and even probes. Looking at them today, they resemble a cross between a surgeon's toolkit and a medieval torture chamber. But to the Egyptians, these were life-saving instruments. A bronze scalpel in their hands was the difference between life and death, even if it looked like something you'd rather keep far away from your skin. Of course, there were limits. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, the surgical text we talked about earlier, makes it clear that not every injury could be fixed. Some injuries were described as an ailment not to be treated. In other words, sorry, this one's above my pay grade. It was an ancient triage system, blunt but effective. If you had a minor wound, they'd patch you up. If you had a severe skull fracture, the healer would probably pat your shoulder, offer you some beer, and suggest you get your affairs in order. Despite the risks, Egyptians didn't shy away from these procedures. Part of the reason might be cultural. They valued order and function, and restoring the body was part of that balance. Another reason is practical necessity. Life along the Nile wasn't all sunbathing and pyramid building. People got injured constantly. Farmers working with heavy tools, builders hauling stone, soldiers clashing with enemies. Broken bones, deep cuts, and nasty infections were daily realities. Surgery wasn't an occasional experiment, it was an essential survival skill. One of the more surprising details is how sanitary some of their practices were. They often cleaned wounds with honey or resins, both of which have natural antibacterial properties. This wasn't germ theory as we know it, but it did help reduce infections. Combine that with decent stitching and a well-set bone and you start to see why some patients made it out alive. The fact that we can still see their healed injuries thousands of years later is a testament to the skill of these ancient doctors and to the toughness of their patients. Still, there's no sugarcoating it. Surgery was brutal. There were no comfortable hospital beds, no sterile gloves, no kindly nurse offering you ice chips, just a mat on the floor, some bronze tools, and the unwavering hope that the guy wielding them had steady hands. If you survived, you earned bragging rights for life. Oh, you wrestled a crocodile? Cute. I had my leg reset by a guy with a copper saw and no anesthesia. In the end, surgery in ancient Egypt was a strange mixture of impressive innovation and sheer human grit. They managed to achieve results that sometimes rival modern practices, but at a cost that makes us wince just thinking about it. Their patients were walking, talking proof of resilience and maybe a little bit of madness. After all, agreeing to surgery without painkillers is the medical equivalent of signing up for the Olympics without shoes. So next time you complain about waiting rooms or the cost of healthcare, just remember, at least no one is holding you down while a priest-doctor stitches you up with a piece of bronze. In ancient Egypt, that was called Tuesday. Step into an ancient Egyptian pharmacy, and you won't find shelves of aspirin, cough syrup, or little orange bottles with your name on them. Instead, you'd be surrounded by baskets of herbs, jars of honey, bundles of garlic, and possibly something that smells suspiciously like moldy bread. In other words, welcome to the original all-natural pharmacy, where the side effects didn't come printed on a label. They came when you realized your medicine made you smell like a vegetable patch. What's astonishing is how much the Egyptians got right. Long before anyone had microscopes or the faintest idea about bacteria, they knew that certain natural substances had healing powers. Honey, for instance, wasn't just a sweet treat to drizzle on bread. They used it as a wound dressing because it had antibacterial properties. Slap some honey on a cut and it helped keep the wound clean and speed up healing. Modern science now confirms this, making the Egyptians look like they had medical degrees thousands of years before universities existed. Of course, honey also made you sticky. so there's a good chance every fly in a 5-mile radius came to help with your recovery. Garlic and onions were another staple of Egyptian medicine. These pungent bulbs weren't just for seasoning your stew. They were thought to boost strength, stamina, and immunity. Workers building the pyramids were supposedly fed garlic and onions to keep them healthy and energized. Imagine clocking in for a day of hauling giant stone blocks and being told your performance bonus is another onion. Still, garlic does have antimicrobial qualities, so perhaps the workers got more than just bad breath out of the deal. Then there was willow bark, which contains salicin, the same chemical that eventually led to aspirin. Egyptians would chew on it or brew it into a concoction to relieve pain and reduce fevers. In other words, they invented painkillers millennia before pharmacies stocked little tablets for headaches. It's easy to picture an exhausted farmer, aching from a long day in the sun, gnawing on a strip of bark and muttering, "This had better work." Moldy bread might sound like a mistake, something you'd throw away today without a second thought, but the Egyptians sometimes applied it to wounds. Why? Because it actually helped fight infection. What they didn't know was that mold could produce antibiotic compounds. Long before Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, the Egyptians were using nature's very first antibiotics by accident. Granted, if your doctor told you to press a loaf of old bread onto your arm today, you'd get a second opinion. But in their world it may have saved lives. Resins and gums from trees also played a huge role in their pharmacy. Frankincense and myrrh weren't just for rituals or gifts from wise men. They were ground into mixtures for everything from stomach aches to skin infections. These sticky substances had preservative qualities, which meant they were useful not only in medicine, but also in embalming. In Egypt, if it smelled nice and came from a tree, chances are someone tried to turn it into medicine. And let's not forget castor oil. Egyptians pressed it from castor beans and used it as a laxative. Nothing says healthcare quite like a cure that clears out your entire digestive system in one sitting. It was effective, though perhaps too effective, and it made sure nobody was ever backed up for long. Their pharmacy didn't stop at plants. Minerals like natron, a natural salt, were also used to clean wounds. Copper compounds found their way into ointments for eye infections. Even beer, that beloved Nile-side beverage, sometimes doubled as a base for medicines, because if you're going to swallow something questionable, it may as well be mixed with beer. Of course, not everything in the Egyptian pharmacy was brilliant. Some recipes went off the rails, mixing perfectly sensible ingredients with things like animal fat, lizard parts, or questionable bodily fluids. But that was part of the philosophy. Try everything, see what sticks. They weren't working with a scientific method as we know it, but they were gathering practical knowledge bit by bit. Some remedies were useless. Others, like honey and willow bark, were centuries ahead of their time. It's tempting to laugh at the idea of smearing garlic paste on a wound or chewing tree bark for pain relief. But when you compare it to what other ancient cultures were doing, like drilling holes in skulls to release demons, the Egyptians come off looking like medical geniuses. They had an uncanny sense for which natural substances helped the body heal, and they weren't afraid to experiment. Imagine walking into a modern pharmacy today, and instead of fluorescent lights and a bored pharmacist behind the counter, you're greeted by a priest healer who offers you a handful of garlic, a jar of honey, and some bark to chew on. Would you trust him? Probably not. And yet if you gave it a try, you'd be surprised how often his remedies worked. Sure, you'd leave smelling like a salad bar, but you might also leave healthier than when you arrived. The brilliance of the Egyptian pharmacy wasn't just in what they used, but in the fact that they wrote it all down, recorded the recipes and passed them along. That meant future healers didn't have to reinvent the wheel or the honey poultice every time someone scraped a knee. It was organized trial and error, and it laid the groundwork for medicine to keep evolving. So yes, the Egyptians invented the original organic pharmacy. Their shelves were stocked with honey jars, garlic bulbs, resins, salts and herbs. The side effects were less may cause drowsiness, and more may attract bees. But for the most part it worked. And the next time someone offers you an all-natural remedy, remember the Egyptians were there first. Now if you thought medicine in ancient Egypt was all honey poultices and soothing herbs, brace yourself. This is the part where the pharmacy gets less Whole Foods and more Frankenstein's pantry, because as much as the Egyptians had moments of medical brilliance, they also had a habit of prescribing remedies that make you wonder if they weren't secretly trolling their patients. After all, it's hard to feel reassured about your health when your doctor cheerfully suggests rubbing crocodile dung on your skin. Let's start with the headline act: crocodile dung. Yes, you heard that right. The Egyptians believed this particular substance had contraceptive powers. Women were instructed to insert it vaginally, sometimes mixed with honey or fermented dough to prevent pregnancy. The logic might have been that the dung created a physical barrier or that its acidity disrupted conception. Whatever the rationale, let's just pause and appreciate the sheer courage it must have taken to follow through with this prescription. Forget modern awkward pharmacy runs. Imagine standing in line to ask for fresh crocodile feces. And crocodiles weren't the only animals to be repurposed. Fat was another favorite ingredient, often used as a base for ointments. That sounds harmless until you realize it wasn't just cow or goose fat. It could be pig fat, lion fat, or even hippo fat, depending on what you were trying to cure. Want to treat a skin infection? Smear on some hippo lard. Got a mysterious rash? Lion grease to the rescue. It's as if the ancient apothecary stocked Noah's Ark, but instead of saving the animals, they melted them down. But animal fat was just the start. Some remedies went full nightmare fuel. For instance, certain treatments required lizard blood or ground-up donkey teeth. Human body parts weren't off limits either. Hair, fingernail clippings, breast milk, even menstrual blood could be mixed into remedies. You can picture the patient, nervously asking, "And how exactly is this supposed to help?" only to get a vague answer about spirits, balance, or some unseen cosmic alignment. One particularly eyebrow-raising prescription involved mixing human excrement with water and drinking it as a treatment for certain illnesses. Now, before you recoil completely, remember that the Egyptians weren't being deliberately disgusting. They genuinely thought these materials carried some sort of power, spiritual, medicinal, or both. The smell alone probably convinced the patient that something powerful was at work. It's the ancient equivalent of, if it tastes this bad, it has to be doing something. There was also the occasional prescription that sounds like the start of a horror story. Grinding bones, boiling organs, or using blood as a salve. Some recipes mixed animal brains with oil, then rubbed it onto the skin. The effect? Likely nothing beyond a new appreciation for scented candles to mask the stench. But in a world where disease felt like an attack from invisible demons, the grosser the cure, the stronger it seemed. It's worth noting that these remedies weren't universal. Not every Egyptian was keen on slathering themselves in lizard goo. The papyri we have are like a giant cookbook of cures. Some practical, some bizarre, some probably never tested beyond a particularly desperate afternoon. Just like today's internet miracle cures, ancient Egyptians had their fair share of questionable advice, except instead of drinking kale juice, you might end up with donkey eyeballs in your ointment. And yet, for all their unpleasantness, these treatments had a certain psychological effect. Imagine being sick and having a healer hand you something so outrageous you couldn't help but believe it must work. Placebo power has always been part of medicine, and if you thought you were rubbing yourself with magical lion grease blessed by a god, maybe you started to feel better simply because you expected to. Of course, we should also give the Egyptians some credit for creativity. Their medical imagination was unlimited. Why stop at honey when you can try crocodile poop? Why stick with herbs when you have an entire zoo and human body to raid for ingredients? It's a testament to their determination to fight illness with whatever they had at hand, even if that meant turning the pharmacy into something that looked more like a cursed kitchen. So, if you were unlucky enough to need a cure in ancient Egypt, your options ranged from the surprisingly effective garlic, honey, willow bark, to the flat-out revolting hippo fat, lizard blood, feces-based potions. And you never quite knew which end of that spectrum your prescription would fall on. The only guarantee was that you'd come away from the healer's hut smelling like you lost a wrestling match with a zoo. In the end, the Egyptians' grossest prescriptions remind us that medicine has always been trial and error. They were working without microscopes, antibiotics, or even a clear understanding of germs. What they did have was resourcefulness and an iron stomach. The fact that some of their patients survived at all is proof that buried beneath the dung, fat, and lizard parts, there was at least a flicker of real medical insight. But if nothing else, their experiments gave us one clear lesson. Sometimes the cure is truly worse than the disease. If you ever thought your last trip to the dentist was traumatic, spare a thought for the poor souls of ancient Egypt. Dental hygiene was less about fresh breath and more about bracing yourself for a lifetime of toothaches that would make even the toughest pharaoh weep into his gold-plated pillow. And before you imagine gentle cleanings with minty toothpaste, remember, the Egyptians' version of Colgate came with a side of donkey hooves, sharp tools, and a lot of prayer. Let's start with the culprit, bread. Not just any bread, but bread that was basically edible sandpaper, because wheat was ground using stone mills. Bits of grit and quartz dust would sneak into the flour. Every bite of bread acted like nature's way of sandblasting your teeth. The result? By the time you reached middle age, your pearly whites looked less like pearls and more like crumbling limestone blocks. Archaeologists studying mummies often find teeth worn down to the roots, exposing nerves and causing infections so painful you'd probably have begged the gods of the afterlife to fast-track your paperwork. And while the Egyptians were masters at building pyramids, they weren't exactly orthodontists. Misaligned jaws, abscesses, and gum disease were rampant. In fact, one of the most common causes of death among the elite wasn't war or assassination. It was infection caused by dental decay. Forget poisonings or conspiracies. Sometimes a grainy loaf of bread was deadlier than any political rival. So how did they deal with this endless dental doom? With remedies that ranged from creative to downright bizarre. Honey, that ancient miracle cure, was a favorite for soothing inflamed gums or packing into cavities. Its natural antibacterial properties probably did help a little, though the sweet stickiness might have been a mixed blessing when already suffering from tooth decay. Herbal remedies were also popular. Ingredients like frankincense, cumin, and coriander were mashed into pastes and stuffed into aching mouths in hopes of numbing the pain or driving away infection. But when the pain was unbearable, desperate measures were taken. This is where powdered donkey hooves enter the story. Yes, donkey hooves were ground into dust and mixed with various herbs to form primitive fillings. Was it effective? Perhaps slightly, if only because it acted as a crude plug. But imagine the taste, your molars now flavored with the delicate aroma of barnyard animal. Other remedies included placing mixtures of onions, goose fat, or even dried figs inside the mouth to soothe pain. Goose fat in particular must have made your breath truly legendary. Possibly the ancient equivalent of garlic breath, but dialed up to 10. There are even records suggesting that ground malachite, a green copper ore, was used for dental treatments, which probably worked wonders as a disinfectant, but came with the minor drawback of being toxic. Yes, you might lose the toothache, but also part of your liver. Now, let's talk about procedures. Archaeological evidence suggests that Egyptians occasionally attempted dental surgery. Some mummies show signs of teeth being wired together with gold thread, likely to stabilize loose ones. Others reveal that holes were drilled into teeth, possibly to drain abscesses, or pack them with medicinal paste. Picture it, lying back while someone with a copper chisel and no anesthesia goes to work on your molars. Your choices were scream, faint, or ascend directly into the afterlife. And then there were the dentists themselves, or more accurately, tooth doctors. One such man, Hesi Ra, is often credited as the world's first named dentist, living around 2600 BCE. His title, Chief of Dentists. That sounds impressive, until you realize his job involved staring into endless mouths filled with rot, pain, and possibly hippo fat. Not exactly the glamorous life of a physician priest. Imagine telling people at parties, "Yes, I'm the guy who shoves herbs into cavities while people scream at me." Still, credit where it's due. Some of their remedies showed real insight. Packing honey into wounds, using herbs with antibacterial properties, and even attempting structural fixes to teeth, all reveal that Egyptians were problem solvers. They just had to make do with what they had. Whether that meant mixing goose grease with cumin or hammering out your dental misery with stone tools. Of course, not every treatment was a win. There are records of magical cures for toothache, which included reciting incantations or wearing protective amulets shaped like hippos and crocodiles. Because when your jaw is throbbing with pain, nothing helps quite like dangling a hippo charm from your neck. At least it gave people something to focus on other than their agony. So what was a dental visit really like in ancient Egypt? Picture yourself shuffling into a mud brick clinic, clutching your cheek, while the dentist digs through jars of herbs, goose fat and donkey hoof powder. He mutters an incantation, smears something suspicious onto your gums, and maybe if you're lucky ties a gold wire around your wobbly tooth. You stumble home, breath smelling like a rotten onion salad hybrid, but grateful you survived the ordeal with your jaw mostly intact. The funny thing is, Egyptians cared deeply about appearances, cosmetics, wigs, perfume, but their smiles were usually a disaster. You could look fabulous in gold jewelry and perfectly applied kohl eyeliner, but flash a grin and everyone would see a mouth that looked like a collapsed pyramid. In a way, the greatest miracle of ancient Egypt wasn't the pyramids or the mummification process. It was that anyone managed to smile at all. If you thought modern fertility clinics could be overwhelming with their charts, graphs, and lab coats, then step into the world of ancient Egypt, where family planning came with a healthy dose of barley, crocodile dung, and a dash of magical thinking. In a society where children were not just blessings but essential for carrying on family lines, ensuring labor on farms, and honoring the gods, fertility was serious business, and as with much of Egyptian medicine, women's healthcare lived at the peculiar crossroads of science, ritual, and downright unsettling prescriptions. Let's start with one of the strangest yet shockingly clever methods of pregnancy detection, the barley and wheat test. Written down in the Ebers papyrus around 1550 BCE, this involved having a woman urinate on bags of barley and emmer wheat. If the grains sprouted, the woman was pregnant. Even more astonishing, the type of grain that sprouted supposedly determined the sex of the child. Barley meant a boy, wheat a girl. Modern studies, yes, someone actually tested this, found it worked to detect pregnancy with about 70% accuracy, though the predict the baby's gender bit was complete nonsense. Still, for a civilization without ultrasounds, this was an impressive proto-laboratory test, albeit one that required you to watch seeds like an ancient gardener for several days. Of course, once pregnancy was confirmed, the Egyptians had all manner of remedies and instructions for the expectant mother. Some were relatively harmless, like using honey to soothe infections or oils to moisturize skin. But then came the stranger side of women's medicine, contraceptives. If you wanted to avoid pregnancy, one of the more notorious prescriptions was the vaginal suppository made of crocodile dung. Mixed with honey, sour milk, and sometimes natron, a salt compound used in mummification, this substance was thought to block or neutralize semen. Whether it actually worked as intended is debatable. The dung was alkaline, which might have killed some sperm, but it also risked introducing horrific infections. You can almost imagine the conversation. So, would you like to try the dung method, or should we check if the pharmacy has a spare jar of lizard blood left? Beyond crocodile waste, other birth control recipes included pastes made of honey and acacia gum, which may have been slightly more effective. Acacia ferments into lactic acid, a mild spermicide, making it one of those rare remedies where the ancients accidentally stumbled onto a working principle. The trouble is that these contraceptives were prepared and applied in ways that sound more like scenes from a horror play than safe medical advice. And yet, for women desperate to space out pregnancies in a world with high maternal mortality, these strange practices carried real significance. Fertility treatments went in the opposite direction. If a woman had trouble conceiving, doctors prescribed equally bizarre rituals and recipes. Some remedies included drinking mixtures laced with dates and beer, while others recommended fumigation treatments, which, yes, means exactly what you're picturing. Herbs or resins were burned and the smoke was directed toward the woman in an attempt to open the womb. The practice combined sympathetic magic with the idea that a closed womb was like a closed jar. It just needed a little extra coaxing. And then there were the incantations. Medical papyri frequently prescribed spells and amulets to ensure fertility, with women wearing charms shaped like Tererit, the hippo-headed goddess of childbirth, or Bede, the dwarf god known for his protective mischief. These weren't just accessories, they were spiritual armor against miscarriage, infertility, and evil spirits that might threaten a mother or child. In a sense, Egyptian women practiced an early form of holistic medicine, where physical, spiritual, and magical health were treated together. Childbirth itself was no gentle affair. Without trained obstetricians or modern medicine, women relied on midwives, family members, and protective rituals. Special birthing stools were sometimes used, and magical spells were recited to keep mother and baby safe during labor. Given the dangers of childbirth in the ancient world, these rituals were as much about comfort and reassurance as they were about medical intervention. The funny thing is, if you strip away the crocodile dung and donkey milk, you can see the same anxieties that persist today. The desire to know whether a pregnancy has begun, the wish to prevent or encourage conception, the fear of miscarriage, and the hope for a safe birth. Ancient Egyptian women may not have had prenatal vitamins or epidurals, but they shared the same basic worries. They just addressed them with barley sprouting experiments and jars of organic swamp slime. So, while modern medicine gives us sterile clinics and carefully measured doses, the women of ancient Egypt turned to a pharmacy stocked with honey, garlic, beer, and animal waste. It was a world where the line between doctor, priest, and sorcerer blurred, and where pregnancy and childbirth were treated as both divine mysteries and medical challenges. To their credit, some of their remedies showed real ingenuity, even if others could send shivers down your spine. Picture this. You're in ancient Egypt, lying on a reed mat, your stomach twisting like it's auditioning for a snake festival. So what's the final verdict on Egyptian medicine? It was equal parts genius and madness, practical and preposterous, groundbreaking and gross. Without it, Hippocrates might have had fewer ideas, Galen fewer books, and we might never have gotten our hands on the humble aspirin tablet. But at the same time, we also might have avoided centuries of medical confusion fueled by magical thinking. The funny part, their legacy feels oddly modern. They pioneered holistic thinking, treating body, mind, and spirit, but often overshot into territory that sounds more like an apothecary run by a prankster god. In the end, Egypt's medical tradition left us with a paradox: brilliant remedies we still use, bizarre concoctions we'd rather forget, and a reminder that the line between science and superstition has always been thin, or, as one might summarize while walking out of an ancient Nile-side pharmacy, thanks for the honey and willow bark. But no thanks, I'll pass on the hippo fat suppositories. Picture this. It's the 6th century BCE and you've just woken up in China. Or rather, the land we now call China, but at this point it's more like a patchwork quilt sewn together by swords, ambition, and sheer chaos. Welcome to the spring and autumn period, a time when states fought constantly, loyalty was negotiable, and the concept of neighborly love mostly applied to who had the better sword. You might think modern traffic is stressful, but at least no one is sending rival armies to steal your rice harvest before lunch. At this point in history, the Zhou dynasty still held the nominal throne, but their power was about as effective as a leaky umbrella in a monsoon. Real authority rested with regional lords, each of whom fancied themselves kings in their own right. These were powerful, often ruthless men with a taste for pomp, power, and unfortunately, endless warfare. The spring and autumn period wasn't named for seasons or poetry. It was named for the official court chronicles that desperately tried to keep track of who had killed whom, who lost a territory, and which state had bribed which neighboring warlord. Spoiler, the chronicles read like a medieval reality TV show, full of betrayal, drama, and slightly questionable fashion choices. Social order, if it existed at all, was fragile. Peasants tilled the land under the watchful eyes of local lords, often wondering if the harvest would feed their families or end up on the dining table of some noble who had conquered their village last week. Life was harsh, and survival wasn't guaranteed. Education, etiquette, or philosophy were luxuries most people couldn't afford. They had more pressing concerns, like not being impaled by a random visiting general. Medicine, mostly superstition and strong soups. Law, often whatever the strongest man could argue convincingly with a sword. And religion, well, everyone prayed a lot, mostly for their own survival, and sometimes for the enemy's demise. It was in this chaotic atmosphere that society began to crumble inward. Traditional values, once enforced by shared beliefs and rigid hierarchies, were under siege. Families fractured, social norms eroded, and people stopped trusting even their neighbors. Imagine family dinners where your cousin might be recruited by a rival warlord halfway through the soup course. That was China before Confucius. Politeness was optional. Survival was mandatory. Contracts were often just promises scribbled on bamboo slips, which were sometimes eaten by pigs, set on fire, or appropriated by ambitious neighbors. In short, order was in freefall, and the concept of a gentleman or junzi, someone moral, wise, and courteous, was closer to a myth than a reality. Even among the ruling elite, the scramble for power often outpaced wisdom. Princes and dukes were constantly maneuvering, scheming and waging wars that sometimes lasted mere months, sometimes decades. Alliances shifted like sand in a gust of wind. One week, two states might be allies. The next, they were trying to hack each other's leaders into bits. Warfare was not a last resort. It was basically the default social activity. If someone invented a board game of strategic massacre, the lords of the spring and autumn period would have been top-tier champions. Culturally, it was a world teetering between brilliance and chaos. Music, poetry, and rituals existed, but often they were overshadowed by the demands of politics, survival, and the constant threat of violence. Morality wasn't just an abstract ideal, it was optional, and the world often rewarded cunning over kindness. Merchants, craftsmen, and scholars struggled to find a place, because in a world run by warlords, practicality ruled. Want to be wealthy or respected, either make a sword, fight someone, or beg a duke to let you live long enough to retire. It was a dangerous, frustrating, and confusing world, and precisely why Confucius's eventual appearance mattered so much. People weren't just looking for better governance, they were searching for a moral compass, a blueprint for how to act when the world around them seemed to have lost all sense. They wanted rules, yes, but also meaning, and more than anything, they needed a guide who could convince them that sometimes, just sometimes, being good wasn't a waste of time. Before Confucius, the idea that manners, respect, and ritual could actually form the backbone of a stable society was almost laughably naive, but the chaos was so extreme that it became fertile ground for someone with vision, patience, and enough charisma to tell warlords, peasants, and scholars alike, hey, maybe stop stabbing each other for 5 minutes, and let's figure out how to live together without constant murder. In short, the China of Confucius's youth was messy, dangerous, and bewildering, a world where politeness was optional, survival was uncertain, and morality was often sidelined in favor of power. And yet, out of this chaos, a thinker emerged who believed that civilization could be built not just with swords, walls, or wealth, but with rituals, respect, and the radical notion that being decent actually mattered. Confucius was born in 551 BCE in the state of Lu, a modest region in what is now Shandong province. Unlike the lords and warlords of his time, Confucius's family wasn't influential, wasn't wealthy, and wasn't destined to appear in court chronicles, except for their son, who would grow up to make the chronicles blush with admiration centuries later. His father, Kong He, passed away when Confucius was very young, leaving the family in a precarious financial and social position. His mother, a strong-willed and resourceful woman, was left to raise him amidst these challenges. She reportedly instilled in him the first lessons of discipline, moral integrity, and perseverance, essentially the early seeds of the philosophy he would later teach. long before it had a name or a classroom. Growing up in such modest circumstances meant Confucius had to earn every scrap of knowledge and respect he received. He wasn't the pampered child of a court official, practicing bowing or memorizing ceremonial rites from birth. Instead, he witnessed firsthand the struggles of ordinary people, the grind of labor, the unpredictability of survival, and the gaps in education that left many unable to navigate the complexities of social life. These experiences shaped his understanding that wisdom and virtue should not be reserved for the elite. They had to be accessible to anyone willing to learn. In other words, Confucius's philosophy of meritocracy had its roots in his own experience as a boy who didn't have connections, titles, or a silver spoon. In his youth, Confucius worked a variety of odd jobs to support himself and his family. He served as a clerk, recording accounts and memoranda, an experience that honed his meticulous attention to detail and his belief in orderly record-keeping. Later, he worked as a herdsman, tending animals and observing the natural rhythms of life. It was perhaps here, among goats, oxen, and sheep, that he realized the importance of structure, hierarchy, and responsibility, principles that would later permeate his ethical teachings. At one point, he also served as a bookkeeper, carefully balancing accounts for local officials. While most children today would consider bookkeeping boring, Confucius reportedly approached every task as an opportunity to understand human behavior, societal needs, and the mechanics of fairness. In essence, he turned menial labor into a laboratory for moral philosophy. Education was central to Confucius's development, even if the formal systems of the time were limited. Books were rare, and learning was usually reserved for the wealthy. But Confucius found ways to study. He reportedly memorized poetry, studied rituals, and sought knowledge from elders whenever possible. He had an insatiable curiosity that went beyond mere rote learning. He wanted to understand why things were done a certain way, how people should behave, and how society could function more harmoniously. Unlike many of his peers who practiced swordsmanship or archery in preparation for a life of military service, Confucius practiced the subtler arts of observation, reflection, and conversation. While other kids were perfecting their sword swings, he was perfecting his ability to say please and thank you, skills he would eventually elevate into a formal system of ethics. Confucius' humility in his early life also shaped his approach to knowledge. He reportedly said that he studied without growing weary and taught without showing off. This mindset was rooted in his early awareness of social inequality. He knew what it felt like to lack status, to be underestimated, and to struggle for recognition. He also witnessed firsthand the consequences of unchecked ambition, deceit, and cruelty, which reinforced his belief that ethical education was essential for a functioning society. Every lesson, every memory from his youth became a stepping stone toward his larger mission, to cultivate virtue in individuals and stability in society. Another interesting aspect of Confucius's early life was his exposure to rituals and ceremonies, even without belonging to a noble household. He observed weddings, funerals, and local rites, learning the significance of respect, timing, and tradition. To him, these were not mere formalities. They were expressions of values that bound communities together. In later life, he would stress that ritual was not empty ceremony, but a practical tool for social cohesion. Essentially, Confucius's early observations allowed him to see the hidden moral structures in ordinary actions, bowing properly, addressing elders respectfully, and observing correct conduct in daily interactions, all of which would later form the backbone of his philosophy. By the time Confucius reached adulthood, he was a young man shaped not by privilege, but by circumstance, curiosity, and reflection. His early life, though humble, was rich in experience. It taught him that virtue was attainable through effort, observation, and study. Regardless of social standing, he had learned the value of discipline, hard work, and moral integrity, lessons that were not taught in schools but through lived experience, observation, and trial. In other words, Confucius's path from nobody to sage was forged in the ordinary moments of life, long before he had disciples, texts, or philosophical fame. And so, while the world around him might have been busy glorifying power, wealth, and conquest, young Confucius was quietly preparing the first seeds of a philosophy that would eventually change the way millions of people thought about life, society, and personal conduct, all while perfecting the art of saying please at the right moment, a skill that, in hindsight, would become revolutionary. While other kids were training for battlefields, Confucius was training for boardrooms of morality, classrooms of ethics, and centuries of awkward fortune cookie misquotations. By the time Confucius reached adulthood, he had accumulated a remarkable understanding of human behavior, ethics, and social order, but he faced a problem. Knowledge alone, no matter how profound, is like a seed dropped on rocky soil. It won't grow unless it's nurtured and shared. Confucius understood this instinctively, and so he became a teacher. But he wasn't just a teacher of facts or poetry. He was a teacher of life itself, guiding people in how to act, think, and exist within society. One of the most revolutionary aspects of Confucius's approach was his openness to students from all backgrounds. In a world where education was the exclusive domain of the aristocracy, Confucius threw open the doors to anyone willing to learn. Imagine the scene. Sons of farmers, merchants, minor officials, and even the occasional wandering poet all gathered around a single man eager for guidance. If modern social media existed, Confucius would have been that guy posting in the group chat, "Hey everyone, learning time, BYOB, bring your own brain." The radical idea here was simple yet profound. Virtue and knowledge should not be inherited, they should be cultivated. Education, according to Confucius, wasn't a privilege, it was a responsibility and an opportunity for anyone willing to put in the effort. His teaching methods were as practical as they were moral. Confucius believed in conversation, questioning, and the careful examination of everyday actions. He didn't just lecture from scrolls, he challenged his students to think, debate, and reflect. A typical lesson could involve dissecting a poem, examining a ritual, or discussing the ethics of a historical event. Every example served a dual purpose, to convey practical wisdom and to cultivate moral discernment. Students were encouraged not merely to memorize rules, but to understand why they mattered, and how applying them could improve both personal conduct and society at large. The core lessons Confucius imparted were deceptively simple: respect, ritual, proper conduct, and filial piety. Respect wasn't a vague notion, it was a tangible practice that influenced every interaction. Ritual wasn't mere ceremony, it was a framework for maintaining harmony in society. Proper conduct wasn't just etiquette, it was the bridge between personal virtue and social stability. And filial piety, the reverence for one's parents and ancestors, was the foundation of moral life, ensuring that ethical behavior started at home before spreading outward into society. One of the most remarkable things about Confucius' school was how it fostered a sense of equality among learners, even if society outside the classroom remained deeply hierarchical. Nobles were not automatically superior, and commoners were not automatically inferior. What mattered was effort, sincerity, and character. This approach created an environment where learning was a meritocracy. The more you worked, the more you grew. Imagine a medieval Chinese classroom where a peasant boy could sit next to a duke's son, and if he worked harder, eventually outshine him in wisdom and moral insight. This was unprecedented. Confucius effectively democratized education centuries before democracy itself existed. Humor, or at least lightness, was also part of his teaching style, although perhaps not in the way we imagine. Confucius was serious about virtue, but he used anecdotes, historical examples, and pointed questions to make lessons memorable. He would ask questions that seemed simple but demanded deep reflection, like, "What does it mean to serve your parents?" or "Why bow before a guest?" The answers were less important than the process of thinking, discussing, and internalizing ethical principles. In a time when rote memorization dominated, his method was revolutionary. It made students active participants in their own moral development. Confucius' school wasn't just a place to learn, it was a microcosm of the society he wanted to create. He emphasized respect for one another, careful attention to social rituals, and responsibility for personal behavior. Students were taught to act with integrity, not because it guaranteed immediate reward, but because virtue itself was a guiding principle. Discipline, courtesy, and moral reasoning were seen as essential tools for navigating the complexities of the wider world, a world still rife with power struggles, corruption, and unpredictable rulers. Another striking feature was the lifelong nature of learning. Confucius didn't believe education ended with youth. He encouraged his students to pursue knowledge and moral improvement continuously. In his classroom, every conversation, every question, and every observation was part of a lifelong practice of reflection. There was no graduation ceremony, learning was an ongoing journey, and the school itself was more like a workshop for life than a place to earn a certificate. By the time his school had gathered dozens of dedicated students, Confucius had created something extraordinary, a model for teaching that combined intellectual rigor, ethical cultivation, and practical application. It was a laboratory of virtue in a chaotic world, producing thinkers, advisors, and officials who could, ideally, bring order to a society desperately in need of guidance. And in doing so, he transformed the act of teaching into a revolutionary tool for social change. In a time when education was reserved for the elite, Confucius basically said, "Open the group chat, everyone's invited," and suddenly, the moral equivalent of a VIP lounge became a bustling public square of ethical inquiry. If Confucius' school was the classroom, then his philosophy of manners was the syllabus that governed everything in life. At the heart of this philosophy were two foundational concepts, Li and Ren. Motive is often translated as ritual or propriety, while Ren is loosely humanness or benevolence. Together, these principles formed a kind of social GPS, a system guiding people in how to behave, interact, and maintain harmony in a chaotic world. But don't let the terminology fool you. Confucius didn't want rigid rules for the sake of bureaucracy. He wanted a society where courtesy, respect, and responsibility weren't optional, but instinctive. Let's start with Li. To modern ears, ritual might sound like incense, fancy robes, or performing a dramatic hand gesture whenever someone enters a room. In practice, Li was much more practical. It included formal ceremonies, everyday etiquette, and behaviors that made social interactions predictable and safe. Think of it as a combination of traffic laws, social norms, and the kind of rules that prevent your neighbor from stabbing you over a misunderstanding about rice distribution. Bow when greeting an elder, speak modestly when addressing someone of higher rank, serve food in the correct order. These weren't arbitrary formalities. They were methods of maintaining order in a society that otherwise teetered on chaos. Ren, on the other hand, was the moral heartbeat of Confucian thought. Humanness meant empathy, compassion, and consideration for others. It was the internal compass that made Li meaningful. Without Ren, rituals could become empty gestures, like performing a bow while secretly thinking, "I hope you trip on your way out." When combined, Li and Ren created a balance between external behavior and internal morality. It wasn't enough to follow the rules. One had to act with genuine respect and care for others. Confucius believed that social order arose when everyone played their role properly, not through force or fear. Every person had a set of responsibilities. Rulers should govern justly, parents should nurture their children, children should respect their elders, and commoners should contribute to the community. These roles weren't about rigid hierarchy alone, they were about creating a network of mutual obligations. When each person acted according to their position and with consideration for others, society functioned smoothly. It was, in essence, a giant cooperative project. Imagine a city where everyone quietly obeyed traffic lights, cleaned up after themselves, and didn't gossip excessively. Then multiply that by 1,000, and you begin to approach Confucius's vision. Everyday courtesy in this philosophy was far from trivial. Simple acts, bowing, greeting politely, serving the right amount of food to the correct person, were not just manners, they were vital mechanisms holding the social fabric together. Think of a table setting. If everyone passed dishes without respect, arguments would erupt, tempers would flare, and family unity might unravel. Now scale that up to a village, a city, or a kingdom, and suddenly be polite is not just good advice, it is civilization itself. Confucius's genius was to see the moral power of small, consistent actions. Unlike philosophers who might focus solely on abstract ethics, he believed that the mundane, the everyday gestures, the subtle courtesies, the tiny observances of ritual, could shape character and, by extension, society. You don't save the world in a single heroic act. You save it by mastering the small things. Bow properly, speak respectfully, hand the teacup with care. These tiny behaviors ripple outward, creating stability and trust. In other words, table manners were statecraft. Serve the soy sauce incorrectly, and chaos ensues. But Confucius didn't reduce his philosophy to dry rules. He illustrated Li and Ren with stories, historical examples, and witty commentary. For instance, he might describe a ruler who neglected ritual, leading to rebellion, or a son who ignored filial duty, resulting in family conflict. The examples were practical, memorable, and often tinged with subtle humor, underscoring the idea that morality was not just theory, it had real consequences. Another key element of this philosophy was self-cultivation. A person who mastered Li and Ren didn't just behave correctly outwardly. They internalized these principles, making them instinctive. Courtesy became second nature. Respect was sincere, and responsibility was embraced willingly. Confucius likened this to polishing a mirror. The more effort invested, the clearer the reflection of virtue. By mastering oneself, one could influence the wider community positively. This idea was revolutionary. It suggested that social harmony starts not with laws or armies, but with the moral and ritual discipline of individuals. Finally, Confucius emphasized that these principles were practical, not mystical. He wasn't advocating for obscure rites performed to appease invisible forces. Instead, he saw rituals and humanness as tools for survival and prosperity in a world that often rewarded cunning, cruelty, and aggression. By practicing Li and Ren, people could navigate social complexity, minimize conflict, and build trust, essentially creating a civilization that could function even amid the uncertainties of human behavior. Despite his growing reputation as a brilliant teacher and moral philosopher, Confucius faced a harsh reality. Wisdom, like fine wine, doesn't always get served to the right people. In the fragmented political landscape of 6th century BCE China, rulers were rarely interested in virtue, ethics, or social harmony. They were more preoccupied with expansion, conquest, and securing enough grain to survive the next invasion. Confucius, armed with advice about morality, ritual, and governance, quickly discovered that being right didn't guarantee influence or a paycheck. His first foray into politics came in his home state of Lu, where he managed to secure a minor administrative post. Here, he observed the machinery of government up close, noting both its potential and its flaws. Confucius advocated for meritocracy, ethical governance, and policies that benefited the common people. In theory, his ideas were brilliant. A government run by virtuous, competent individuals would be stable, prosperous, and respected. In practice, well, let's just say the princes were more interested in hunting expeditions and extravagant feasts than in moral philosophy. The frustration was immediate. Confucius encountered rulers who were intrigued by his speeches but unwilling to implement them. He advised on fair taxation, proper conduct of officials, and the importance of leading by example, only to see corruption, favoritism, and short-term thinking prevail. In one famous anecdote, he suggested that the ruler promote competent officials regardless of social rank, a radical idea at the time. The response? A polite nod, followed by the appointment of a relative with zero qualifications. Confucius learned quickly that noble intentions alone were insufficient when ambition, greed, and vanity dominated the halls of power. Undeterred, Confucius embarked on a journey that would define much of his adult life, traveling from state to state, offering his counsel wherever it might be welcomed. This period, spanning roughly 14 years, can be seen as an early version of modern consulting, except Confucius' clients were skeptical, fickle, or outright hostile, and payment was often non-existent. He moved from Lu to Wei, Song, Chen, and other states, presenting his proposals for just governance and ethical rule. His strategy was simple: demonstrate that moral integrity and competent leadership could stabilize society, reduce conflict, and improve prosperity. The problem was that many rulers found his advice inconvenient. War, intrigue, and ostentatious displays of power were far more appealing than quiet virtue. During these travels, Confucius witnessed firsthand the stubbornness of human nature in the face of wisdom. Princes would listen attentively to his arguments, nod in agreement, and then promptly resume destructive habits. It was a lesson in patience, humility, and resilience. Confucius continued to teach and advise, understanding that even if immediate results were rare, planting seeds of thought could bear fruit later through his students or through shifts in societal attitudes. This was, in essence, long-term strategy. Influence society one conversation at a time, knowing that the world rarely changes overnight. His wandering years also gave Confucius an expanded perspective on culture, governance, and human behavior. Each state had its own customs, policies, and social hierarchies, and Confucius carefully studied them, comparing and contrasting approaches to leadership. These observations reinforced his belief that ethical principles were universal, but their application had to be sensitive to local circumstances. He recognized that morality alone was insufficient without practical understanding of politics and society. This combination of ethics and pragmatism would later define his political philosophy. Despite the setbacks, Confucius remained committed to his mission. He gathered students along the way, many of whom had their own ambitions of service and influence. Together, they debated strategies for governance, analyzed historical precedents, and practiced the rituals and ethics that Confucius taught. These disciples became living extensions of his philosophy, carrying his ideas into realms where his personal influence might never reach. It was a clever workaround. If the rulers wouldn't listen, perhaps the next generation would. The humor of this period is hard to miss. Imagine a man tirelessly preparing detailed plans, offering wisdom that could prevent wars, promote justice, and stabilize societies, only to be met with shrugs, feasts, or outright dismissal. Confucius was, in essence, like that guy who brings a PowerPoint to a party. Technically useful, rigorously researched, and potentially life-changing, but nobody asked for it, and most attendees were far more interested in the snacks. Still, Confucius' perseverance during these years cemented his reputation as both a moral authority and a teacher. While he didn't achieve immediate political reform, he laid the groundwork for a philosophy that could outlast the whims of any ruler. His experiences traveling from state to state, facing rejection and witnessing the folly of leaders, enriched his teachings and informed the advice he would give to his disciples. The wandering politician, constantly on the road, became a wandering philosopher, turning frustration into opportunity and failure into long-term influence. In short, the image of Confucius during these years is both admirable and slightly comical. A sage with plans for a just society, walking from state to state, facing disinterested rulers, and trying to convince anyone who would listen that morality, competence, and courtesy were better than chaos and conquest. It's a story of persistence, principle, and subtle humor, the mark of a man whose vision extended far beyond immediate recognition. He was like that guy who brings a PowerPoint to a party. Technically useful, but nobody asked for it, and yet centuries later, everyone would be wishing they had paid attention. Confucius's influence on the world didn't peak during his lifetime, far from it. While wandering from state to state, offering advice that was largely ignored by rulers, he was quietly building something far more enduring, a network of devoted disciples who would carry his ideas into the future. These students were the first believers in the transformative power of virtue, ritual, and proper conduct. They recorded his teachings, debated them, and lived them, ensuring that the essence of Confucius' philosophy would survive long after his own time. Central to this legacy is the Analects, a compilation of Confucius's sayings, dialogues, and reflections assembled by his disciples over decades. Unlike a single-authored book, the Analects are more like a patchwork quilt of wisdom, stitched together by observation, memory, and discussion. They cover everything from proper behavior at a banquet to the qualities of a moral ruler, blending practical advice with ethical philosophy. It's not always linear. Some passages repeat ideas in different contexts, while others are cryptic or poetic, but the overall effect is remarkable. A record of one man's thoughts that would go on to shape the moral and political fabric of an entire civilization. The Analects allowed Confucian values to transcend the immediate chaos of 6th century BCE China. Concepts like Ren, humanness, Li, ritual/propriety, and filial piety became not just personal ideals but societal cornerstones. Over time, these principles were embedded into family life, governance, and education. Filial piety, for instance, was elevated beyond mere obedience. It became a moral imperative, shaping how generations interacted with parents, elders, and ancestors. Respect and ritual structured daily life, forming the invisible scaffolding that maintained social cohesion in a world that might otherwise have collapsed under ambition, greed, and negligence. Perhaps the most concrete expression of Confucius's enduring influence was in government. During the Han Dynasty, several centuries after his death, Confucian philosophy became the official guiding ideology for the imperial court. His ideas shaped bureaucratic recruitment, ethical standards for officials, and governance practices that emphasized moral integrity alongside competence. The imperial examinations, which determined who could serve in government, drew heavily on Confucian classics including the Analects. In effect, a system that began as ethical guidance from one man of humble origins evolved into the backbone of Chinese bureaucracy. Talented individuals could rise based on merit, knowledge, and virtue, a remarkable echo of Confucius's own belief in education for all. Centuries before universal schooling existed, education more broadly was also transformed by Confucius's teachings. Beyond the elite halls of the palace, his ideas influenced schools, local officials, and private tutors. Students studied not only to pass exams but to cultivate character, develop ethical judgment, and learn the social rituals that maintained harmony. Confucius's insistence that virtue and learning were inseparable created a culture in which scholarship was a moral practice, not simply a way to acquire wealth or status. This dual emphasis on knowledge and morality distinguished Confucian education from purely technical or strategic schooling, ensuring that students aspired to both competence and ethical behavior. The legacy also extends to family structures. Confucian emphasis on filial piety and proper conduct shaped household dynamics, inheritance practices, and social expectations. Families became microcosms of society, where respect, ritual, and moral cultivation were practiced daily. In a way, Confucius turned every family dinner, birthday ceremony, and ancestral offering into a small experiment in civilization building. The home became a laboratory for virtue, preparing each generation to engage with society ethically and responsibly. Humor aside, the influence of Confucius's students cannot be overstated. They essentially acted as the PR team and biographers of the philosopher, meticulously preserving his wisdom and ensuring it reached future generations. Confucius himself may not have achieved political success or widespread recognition in life, but through the dedication of his disciples, his philosophy flourished in ways he could scarcely have imagined. His teachings became so central that centuries later, rulers, scholars, and commoners alike would quote him, debate him, and structure society according to his principles. It's tempting to imagine Confucius reacting to his posthumous fame. In life, he may have struggled to convince rulers to adopt his advice. In death, he became an icon of wisdom, moral authority, and education. His students made him the Beyoncé of philosophy, flawless, widely admired, and endlessly quoted. Every dinner conversation about proper behavior, every civil service examination, every respectful bow to one's parents, carried the echoes of a man who had once walked from state to state, largely ignored, yet full of conviction that virtue mattered. In the end, Confucius's legacy is a testament to the power of persistence, teaching, and careful cultivation of ideas. While his travels and political efforts may have met resistance, his philosophy found fertile ground in the minds of his students and in the structures of Chinese society. The Analects preserved his teachings, the bureaucracy institutionalized them, and the culture at large lived by them, transforming not only individuals but entire generations. From a modest man in Lu to the architect of a civilization's moral compass, Confucius's influence proves that the right ideas, once nurtured, can outlast rulers, wars, and even centuries of skepticism. In the modern era, Confucius's global reach has only expanded. Confucius Institutes established by the Chinese government are now present in universities worldwide. Their mission is to spread Chinese language and culture, promoting understanding and appreciation of Confucian heritage. Through these programs, thousands of students from diverse backgrounds learn not only Mandarin but also the cultural values intertwined with Confucian thought, respect for learning, emphasis on personal discipline, and attention to social responsibility. While critics sometimes debate the political aspects of these institutes, there's no denying that Confucius's legacy continues to shape global education, cross-cultural exchange, and ethical discourse. Beyond formal institutions, Confucian thought has influenced modern leadership, business ethics, and organizational behavior. Principles such as leading by example, cultivating trust, and emphasizing ethical decision-making resonate in boardrooms, schools, and government offices. Contemporary business ethics often echo Confucian ideas. A manager who respects employees, considers the long-term impact of decisions, and balances efficiency with morality is, knowingly or not, applying Confucius's centuries-old wisdom. In this sense, the sage of Lu has transitioned from philosopher to corporate consultant, without a salary, travel expenses, or a single LinkedIn post. Of course, part of Confucius's modern fame comes from the widespread but often inaccurate quotations attributed to him. Fortune cookies, motivational posters, and self-help books frequently misquote or oversimplify his teachings. Man who stands on toilet is high on pot, they joke. Or everything will be okay if you follow your heart, which is charming but nowhere to be found in the Analects. This misattribution has made Confucius a household name in ways he could hardly have imagined. While the wisdom of his original texts emphasizes subtlety, context, and moral reasoning, popular culture has condensed it into bite-sized, sometimes absurd aphorisms. If Confucius were alive today, he might be raising an eyebrow or filing lawsuits against motivational speakers for plagiarism. Despite these oversimplifications, the essence of Confucian thought persists. Respect, responsibility, education, and ethical conduct remain as relevant today as they were over 2,500 years ago. In classrooms, workplaces, and governments, people still draw upon his teachings to guide behavior, foster cooperation, and create social cohesion. The notion that small, consistent acts of courtesy and integrity can influence wider society resonates universally. A polite gesture, a fair decision, or a thoughtful word still holds the power to ripple outward, just as Confucius envisioned. Confucius's legacy is also evident in global discussions about morality and leadership. In an era defined by rapid technological change, political polarization, and cultural complexity, many of his principles, integrity, empathy, and lifelong learning, offer practical guidance. Leaders who prioritize virtue over vanity, who cultivate knowledge alongside ethical judgment, and who recognize the importance of social harmony, demonstrate the continued relevance of Confucian thought. Essentially, the same sage who once walked the states of Lu, Wei, and Song, offering advice to skeptical rulers, now provides guidance to leaders navigating the complexities of the modern world. Even humor plays a role in this legacy. In a sense, Confucius has become a cultural icon whose presence can be both serious and playful. Fortune cookies, memes, and clever misquotes introduce his philosophy to audiences who might never pick up a classical text. While these simplified versions can misrepresent the depth of his thought, they also spark curiosity and engagement, encouraging new generations to explore the Analects, examine ethical questions, and reflect on personal conduct. The humor, intentional or not, keeps Confucius alive in the cultural imagination. Ultimately, Confucius today is both timeless and adaptable. His teachings, once confined to the classrooms of Lu and the ears of a small circle of disciples, now reach across continents, shaping thought, behavior, and culture. From ancient ceremonies to modern offices, from imperial examinations to online lectures, his ideas continue to guide, inspire, and occasionally amuse. The man who once turned table manners into statecraft has become a global sage, proving that wisdom, patience, and ethical consistency can transcend time, place, and even the occasional fortune cookie distortion. Picture England in the 7th and early 8th centuries, a patchwork of warring kingdoms, dense forests, foggy moors, and small settlements struggling to survive. Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the centre, Wessex in the south, and a collection of smaller territories in between. If you tried to travel from one end of England to the other, you'd need a sword, a horse, and the patience to deal with rival warlords who might think you're lunch, or worse, a messenger delivering bad news from their enemy. This was a land where the concept of national history didn't exist. Instead, people lived in fragmented realms of oral tradition, myth, and rumor. Information was scarce, and literacy was rarer still. Most knowledge was passed from person to person, story to story, bard to villager. Think of it like a game of historical telephone. A hero might slay 10 dragons in one retelling, 3 in the next, and somehow become king of half the island by the time the tale reached the next village. Accuracy was optional. It was an era in which fact and legend were so intertwined that villagers couldn't tell if the man leading them to battle was actually a nobleman or just some guy with a fancy hat. Before Bede, you might say. If someone asked who won a battle, you had to trust the guy who yelled it across the village. Spoiler, he probably made himself the hero. The oral culture had its charms. Storytellers, bards, and skalds were the historians of the day, carrying songs of victories, defeats, and bizarre adventures across rivers and forests. They memorized genealogies, tribal conflicts, and heroic deeds, and they added a dash of drama for effect. One bard might claim that a king single-handedly defeated an entire army with nothing but a spoon and a squirrel. Later generations would believe it because, well, the story was entertaining and at least partially plausible if you squinted. Villagers didn't care much about strict accuracy. They cared about identity, inspiration, and entertainment. History, in this sense, was more like storytelling than scholarship. Religion and the church also played a role in shaping collective memory. Monks were beginning to record events, but their accounts were limited, often biased toward moral lessons, and sometimes written centuries after the fact. They used history to teach virtue rather than to document facts precisely. A king might be remembered not just for battles won, but for being pious or for suffering divine punishment after a moral lapse. The result was a tapestry of England's past that was part record, part morality play, part gossip column. If you wanted to know what really happened, you'd need to cross-reference multiple bards, priests, and travelers, and even then you might just end up with an entertaining story that left out inconvenient details, like who actually paid for the mead. England's political situation added to the chaos. Rival kingdoms constantly jockeyed for power, raiding one another, forming fleeting alliances, and betraying friends without a second thought. Borders were fluid, loyalties were fickle, and the average person spent most days worrying about survival rather than chronicling events. Agriculture, hunting, and small-scale crafts were central to daily life, while the occasional battle or raid added excitement and sometimes tragedy. Every skirmish, every succession, and every festival could be turned into a story, but who told it mattered more than whether it was accurate. This instability and lack of consistent record-keeping made England fertile ground for someone like Bede. Before him, historical memory was scattered, anecdotal, and heavily influenced by the storyteller's personality. Heroes could be invented on a whim, disasters exaggerated for effect, and entire lineages rewritten to suit the storyteller's needs. Without a centralized or systematic approach to recording events, The past was a fluid, malleable thing, shaped as much by imagination as by reality. Villagers didn't worry about inconsistencies. They worried about whether their hall would be raided next and whether they would get an extra loaf of bread. History was less about facts and more about identity, culture, and occasionally entertainment. Yet, amidst the fog of myth and chaos, a shift was quietly brewing. Some monks, cloistered in stone abbeys and candle-lit rooms, began to realize that memory could be preserved, that stories could be recorded, and that knowledge could outlast the limitations of oral tradition. One such monk would later rise to prominence not through sword or throne, but through pen and parchment. Bede would transform this scattered collection of stories, legends, and moral anecdotes into something systematic, something coherent, and something that would endure for centuries, history in a recognizable form. In essence, England before Bede was a land of storytellers, heroes, myths, and muddled memory. People survived, feasted, fought, and told stories, but they had no framework for understanding the past as a sequence of events rather than a series of entertaining anecdotes. It was messy, chaotic, and vividly human. A perfect backdrop for a monk whose life mission would be to organize, record, and rationalize England's story. Without him, the heroic deeds of kings and the misadventures of villagers might have remained floating in oral tradition, endlessly transformed and misremembered. Bede's arrival marked the beginning of recorded history in England, turning hearsay into chronicles, legend into learning, and chaos into narrative. Before Bede, if someone asked who won a battle, you had to trust the guy who yelled it across the village. Spoiler, he probably made himself the hero. Bede was born in 672 CE in the Kingdom of Northumbria, a region that would eventually become one of the intellectual hubs of early medieval England. His family was pious but not wealthy or powerful, ordinary people in extraordinary times. From an early age, Bede showed a remarkable inclination toward learning, a trait that would define his entire life. In those days, education was often a privilege of the elite or the clergy, but for Bede, it became the vehicle through which he would leave an enduring mark on history. Remarkably, Bede was dedicated to the monastic life from a very young age. According to historical records, he was entrusted to the care of the monastery at Wearmouth Jarrow as a child. This might sound extreme by modern standards, entrusting a small child to a stone building filled with chanting monks, but in that era, monasteries were not just religious centers. They were the primary institutions of learning, literacy, and culture. They served as schools, libraries, and laboratories of scholarship. For Bede, this environment was a goldmine of knowledge waiting to be explored. At the monastery, Bede's daily routine was a mix of study, labor, and devotion. Early mornings began with prayers, followed by hours of learning Latin, the language of the church, and scholarship. While other children might have been climbing trees or playing with sticks, Bede was mastering Latin declensions, parsing sentences, and memorizing biblical texts. Humorously, one could imagine him, small in stature but towering in intellect, sneaking a glance at the scrolls while other kids pretended to fight imaginary dragons. While other kids were climbing trees, one might quip, Bede was climbing the ladder of Latin grammar. Bede's education was extensive and rigorous. He learned not only the language and literature of the church, but also the rudiments of history, theology, and even mathematics. Monks at the time had a strong emphasis on copying manuscripts accurately, and Bede quickly became adept at this painstaking process. Copying texts was more than busy work. It was a form of devotion, a way to internalize knowledge, and a contribution to the preservation of culture. Each carefully inscribed letter connected Bede with centuries of learning, creating a direct line from classical and biblical texts to the minds of future generations. The young monk also became familiar with the complex system of the liturgical calendar. Calculating the date of Easter, for instance, required astronomical observation, numerical skill, and a deep understanding of theology. While many might consider such studies dull, Bede approached them with precision and curiosity, combining scholarship with spiritual reflection. It was a rare blend, a child monk meticulously calculating lunar cycles while simultaneously contemplating the divine order of the universe. One could imagine him thinking, if the moon and the sun are aligned correctly, then humanity can celebrate Easter properly, and maybe avoid chaos at the abbey breakfast table. Bede's intellectual appetite was insatiable. He didn't just copy manuscripts, he questioned, commented, and synthesized knowledge. Monks often worked collaboratively, discussing texts, debating theological points, and exchanging ideas. Bede absorbed all of this, displaying a precocious understanding of complex subjects. His dedication was not motivated by fame or reward. Those concepts were alien to a young monk, but by the intrinsic joy of learning and the belief that knowledge was a form of devotion. In essence, Bede's early life was a masterclass in combining curiosity, discipline, and spirituality. Despite the rigors of monastic life, Bede's youth was also marked by human warmth and community. Monks worked, ate, prayed, and studied together, forming bonds that provided both support and intellectual stimulation. Bede's mentors recognized his brilliance early on, encouraging him to read widely and think critically. It is not difficult to imagine a small boy hunched over a candle-lit desk, copying a manuscript while older monks watched in awe, occasionally muttering, "That one will either become a great scholar or never touch a sword again." In that sense, Bede's early life combined the best of two worlds, a structured, disciplined environment with the freedom to explore ideas and cultivate his mind. The young monk's early experiences at Wearmouth Jarrow laid the foundation for a lifetime of scholarship. By immersing himself in texts, mastering Latin, learning history, theology, and science, Bede positioned himself to become not merely a monk but a historian, teacher, and scholar of enduring significance. His humble beginnings, far from limiting him, were a springboard into intellectual greatness. Every manuscript copied, every lesson learned, and every hour spent observing the heavens contributed to the meticulous, thoughtful scholar he would become. By the time Bede reached adolescence, he had already acquired a depth of knowledge and a discipline of mind that would define his career. Unlike many of his contemporaries who might have remained local scholars or focused solely on liturgical tasks, Bede's combination of curiosity, precision, and devotion prepared him to take on the ambitious project of recording history itself. In short, while England before him was chaotic and poorly chronicled, Bede's early life was a calm, studious incubator of genius. The monk, who once struggled to hold a quill steadily in candlelight, would grow into the venerable Bede, a figure whose writings would shape the understanding of England for centuries. While other kids were climbing trees, Bede was climbing the ladder of Latin grammar. Life at a Northumbrian monastery was structured, disciplined, and to modernize, extraordinarily meticulous. For Bede, these surroundings were both a classroom and a laboratory for the mind. Monks spent long hours in the scriptorium, copying texts with painstaking care, each letter forming a bridge between past and future knowledge. This repetitive labor was more than mechanical work. It was devotion, meditation, and intellectual exercise rolled into one. Bede approached it with both reverence and curiosity, absorbing lessons from the texts he copied, pondering the logic behind each passage, and slowly building the foundation of what would become his lifelong career as a historian. Copying manuscripts was a precise art. Mistakes could distort sacred texts, historical accounts, or instructional guides for future monks. Bede, with his meticulous eye and steady hand, excelled at this task. He didn't just transcribe, he reflected on the content, sometimes annotating texts with clarifications, observations, or moral commentary. It was a scholarly approach that combined fidelity with interpretation. Monks who merely copied were like assembly line workers, but Bede treated every manuscript as an opportunity to engage critically with the material. He was, in effect, a curator of knowledge, shaping how the wisdom of the past would reach future generations. But Bede's intellectual curiosity didn't stop at letters and parchment. He delved into mathematics, astronomy, and timekeeping with equal enthusiasm. Understanding numbers was essential for monastic life, calculating the dates of religious feasts, measuring time for prayer, and recording historical events required precision. The Christian calendar, particularly the date of Easter, was notoriously complicated. It relied on lunar cycles, solar years, and ecclesiastical conventions, all of which had to align perfectly. Miscalculate the date, and the abbey could be celebrating Easter on a completely wrong Sunday. A potentially catastrophic error in the eyes of devout monks. Bede mastered these calculations, combining observation with arithmetic and ecclesiastical rules. He was not just a monk, he was a celestial accountant, a calendar architect, and a guardian of temporal order. Astronomy, too, fascinated him. By observing the heavens, Bede could refine his calculations and understand the natural rhythms that governed both the spiritual and temporal worlds. The waxing and waning of the moon, the positions of the stars, the apparent movement of the sun, all these elements informed his work. While other monks might have focused solely on scripture, Bede saw patterns in the sky as part of a grand cosmic order. It was an approach that blended science, theology, and philosophy. One could imagine him quietly charting the stars by candlelight, while his peers slept, murmuring to himself about cycles, eclipses, and how all this would help keep Easter on schedule. This combination of textual mastery and scientific observation naturally led Bede to write. His early work spanned biblical exegesis, liturgical commentary, and historical reflection. Each text was an exercise in clarity, precision, and utility. He sought to make knowledge accessible and coherent, not just for himself but for other monks, students, and future readers. In his historical writings, Bede began the painstaking work of organizing scattered information about events, rulers, and kingdoms into coherent narratives. He distinguished fact from hearsay, placed events in chronological order, and often offered moral reflections. The goal was not merely to record what happened, but to help readers understand the significance and lessons of those events. Bede's approach to history was methodical and analytical. He recognized the importance of dates, sequences, and sources long before these concepts became standard in historical scholarship. He compared accounts, reconciled conflicting reports, and ensured that his narratives reflected both spiritual and temporal realities. This careful attention to detail would later culminate in his masterpiece, the Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum. But even in these early efforts, one can see the historian forming a scholar who would treat the past with rigor, clarity, and purpose. It's worth noting that all this work required immense patience and dedication. Monastic life was regimented, but it could also be monotonous. Hours spent copying texts, calculating dates, and observing stars demanded focus and resilience. For Bede, it was a labor of love, a devotion to knowledge as sacred duty. Humorously, one might imagine him in modern terms. Bede spent his life counting days and copying manuscripts. In modern terms, he was the spreadsheet wizard of Northumbria, endlessly crunching numbers, auditing events, and ensuring the abbey's calendar didn't spark holy chaos. By merging textual work, numerical precision, and critical thinking, Bede cultivated a skill set that was extraordinary for his time. He wasn't merely a monk following instructions. He was a scholar shaping the intellectual life of his community and laying the groundwork for centuries of historical writing. Each manuscript he copied, each astronomical observation he recorded, and each calculation he performed brought him closer to the role for which history would remember him. The combination of devotion, curiosity, and analytical rigor made Bede not just a monk but a pioneer, a thinker who bridged the gap between faith, knowledge, and the documentation of human experience. In this phase of his life, Bede exemplified the perfect synthesis of monastic discipline and intellectual ambition. He demonstrated that scholarship could be rigorous, creative, and spiritually enriching simultaneously. The young historian in the candle-lit scriptorium was quietly transforming the way England and eventually the world would understand its own past. By patiently copying, counting, observing, and writing, Bede was building the foundation of history itself. Bede spent his life counting days and copying manuscripts. In modern terms, he was the spreadsheet wizard of Northumbria. By the early 8th century, Bede had already mastered the monastic disciplines of copying, counting, and scholarly reflection. But his ambitions were larger than just preserving texts or calculating dates. He wanted to make sense of the chaotic patchwork of England's past and give it a coherent story. This vision led to the creation of his masterpiece, the Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, completed in 731 CE, often translated as the ecclesiastical history of the English people. It was a work that combined careful historical observation, moral reflection, and theological insight, effectively inventing a framework for understanding England as a continuous, interconnected story. The Historia begins with the Roman invasions, notably Julius Caesar's expeditions in 55 and 54 BCE, and proceeds through the arrival of Christianity, the formation of English kingdoms, and Bede's own contemporary events. He meticulously traced the spread of Christianity, detailing the efforts of missionaries such as Augustine of Canterbury, who brought the new faith to Kent, and highlighting the establishment of monastic centres across the land. Bede's genius was in turning disparate events into a narrative tapestry. Wars, conversions, rulers and saints all became threads woven into a story with rhythm, coherence and purpose. One of the most remarkable aspects of Bede's work was his attempt to blend historical fact with moral instruction. While modern historians prize objectivity above all, Bede wrote in a time when history served a didactic purpose. Kings were praised or criticized according to their piety and adherence to Christian virtues. Miracles and divine interventions were included not to confuse the reader, but to highlight moral truths and demonstrate God's active role in human affairs. To Bede, history wasn't merely a record of events, it was a teaching tool. Every battle, succession, or plague carried a lesson about faith, duty, and the consequences of moral choice. Bede's methodology was surprisingly modern in some respects. He sought out multiple sources, evaluated the reliability of witnesses, and cited authorities where possible. He combined oral traditions, letters from church leaders, earlier chronicles, and his own observations. This careful compilation allowed him to correct errors, harmonize accounts, and create a version of history that was both compelling and reasonably trustworthy for his time. Yet he was also aware of the limits of knowledge. In several passages, Bede explicitly notes when he could not verify a claim, demonstrating a scholarly humility that anticipates modern historiography. The Historia was also revolutionary in giving England a sense of national identity. Before Bede, the concept of England was fragmented, kingdoms fought each other, stories were localized, and collective memory was fluid. By chronicling the past from a broad island-wide perspective, Bede offered a vision of England as a connected cultural and spiritual entity. Readers could see a narrative that stretched across centuries, linking the actions of distant kings to the moral and spiritual lessons of the Church. In many ways, Bede essentially invented the idea of a national biography, documenting how a people, rather than a single ruler, evolved over time. And the best part, his subjects couldn't fact-check him on Twitter. Bede's narrative style was clear, precise, and accessible. He wrote in polished Latin, suitable for scholars and clergy, but he also emphasized clarity over unnecessary ornamentation. Unlike some chroniclers who revel in flowery description, Bede kept his prose direct, weaving dates, names, and events into a rhythm that allowed readers to follow both the sequence of history and the moral significance behind it. He organized the work into 5 books, each addressing a particular period or theme, creating a structure that was both logical and readable, a rarity in an era dominated by oral storytelling. Beyond politics and war, Bede included accounts of miracles, saints, and the spread of Christian teachings. These stories were not merely fanciful additions, they reinforced the notion that history was intertwined with divine purpose. Missionaries' journeys, conversions, and acts of piety were all examples of God guiding human affairs. At the same time, Bede included enough practical details, names of kings, dates of events, and descriptions of geography, that the work functioned as a reference for scholars, clergy, and rulers. It bridged the gap between the spiritual and the practical, showing that history could be both enlightening and useful. It's easy to underestimate the audacity of Bede's project. He was a monk in a remote Northumbrian monastery, physically isolated from major urban centres and political power. Yet he undertook the colossal task of writing the first comprehensive account of his people's history. He relied on letters, reports from traveling clergy, oral accounts, and whatever manuscripts were available. In essence, Bede created a detailed, organized history from a patchwork of fragmented sources, all while maintaining an eye toward moral instruction and spiritual meaning. The impact of the Historia Ecclesiastica was immediate and enduring. It became the standard reference for the history of early England, influencing generations of scholars, chroniclers, and leaders. Its combination of narrative clarity, moral reflection, and historical insight set a model for writing history that would endure for centuries. For Bede, history was not just about what happened, it was about understanding why it happened, what it meant, and how it could guide future generations. If there's one thing that set Bede apart from his contemporaries, it wasn't just his mastery of history or Latin, it was his obsession with numbers, time, and the cosmos. To him, the universe had order, and order could be understood, measured, and reflected in human life. For the monks of Northumbria, life was already dictated by the rhythm of prayers, meals, and work. But Bede took this obsession a step further. He counted, calculated, and charted everything he could see, creating systems that blended the spiritual, the historical, and the scientific. Bede's work on calendars was perhaps the most immediately practical and widely influential aspect of his scholarship. Calculating the date of Easter was a notoriously tricky affair, involving a combination of lunar cycles, solar years, and ecclesiastical conventions. If miscalculated, the timing of one of the most important Christian festivals would be off, potentially disrupting the rhythm of church life. Bede applied careful mathematical analysis, observations of the moon, and knowledge of the Julian calendar to ensure accuracy. He didn't just guess, he systematized the computation, producing tables and formulas that monks across England could use to determine Easter precisely. Bede calculated the exact date of Easter more times than anyone else in England, one could say. Basically, he was the OG Google Calendar. His interest in astronomy went beyond mere calendar calculations. Bede observed the movement of the sun, moon, and stars, noting patterns, eclipses, and the cycles of the heavens. He saw the sky as a divine mechanism, each movement a reflection of God's order in the universe. To Bede, the stars were not just decoration, they were indicators of cosmic rhythms that influenced earthly life. Understanding them was both a scientific pursuit and a form of devotion, a way of aligning human activity with the divine plan. One can picture him at night, quill in hand, candle flickering, sketching the positions of celestial bodies while murmuring contemplations on time, eternity, and the next feast day. Numbers themselves fascinated Bede. He wasn't content with simple counting. He explored symbolic, historical, and theological applications of numeracy. Certain numbers carried sacred significance: 3 for the Trinity, 7 for completeness, 40 for periods of trial. He used numbers to organize historical events, structure his writings, and provide moral and spiritual lessons. For Bede, numbers were more than quantitative, they were qualitative, revealing divine order in history and in nature. History became intelligible not just through events, but through their placement in time, measured and meaningful. Bede's meticulous work also extended to chronology more broadly. He wanted to understand how events unfolded across years, decades, and centuries. By dating events accurately, he could see patterns, link outcomes, and provide readers with a sense of historical continuity. Kings' reigns, missionary journeys, battles, and natural phenomena were all tied together with precise timing. This allowed him to draw moral and spiritual lessons, showing that human actions were situated within a larger divine and temporal framework. The past, to Bede, was not random, it was ordered, teachable, and understandable. Beyond calendars and history, Bede had a keen interest in natural observation. He studied the phases of the moon, the changing seasons, and the cycles of plants and animals. These observations were not purely scientific. They were part of a broader worldview in which the natural world reflected divine wisdom. Bede's approach was integrative. Mathematics, astronomy, history, and theology were interwoven, each informing the other. Numbers and observations were tools for understanding God's creation and humanity's place within it. His work required patience, precision, and an eye for detail. Copying texts and computing dates demanded long hours of concentration. Misreading a table of lunar cycles could throw off the computation of Easter for the entire monastery and possibly the region. Bede approached this task with the rigor of a modern scientist, but with the understanding that his work was ultimately in service to God. He was not seeking fame or recognition. He was seeking truth, order, and alignment between human life and the divine. Bede's achievements in timekeeping and astronomy also had practical and cultural significance. Accurate calendars allowed monasteries to organize feasts, fasts, and liturgical cycles. His chronological systems provided a framework for understanding history, linking events across kingdoms and centuries. Even rulers and clerics relied on Bede's expertise, whether explicitly or indirectly, to maintain social and religious order. Through his work, the abstract calculations of time became meaningful in daily life, connecting prayer, governance, and study in a harmonious rhythm. It is remarkable to consider that all of this was accomplished in a relatively remote Northumbrian monastery. No telescopes, no printing presses, no digital spreadsheets, just observation, careful computation, and devotion. Bede's legacy in astronomy and chronology would influence European scholarship for centuries, shaping the way time, dates, and history were understood. He demonstrated that meticulous counting and observation were not merely mechanical tasks, but essential tools for comprehending the universe and human existence. Bede's life in the quiet monastery of Jarrow might have seemed small and insular, but his influence would stretch far beyond the walls of Northumbria, traveling across kingdoms, monasteries, and centuries. While he spent much of his life copying manuscripts, calculating dates, and writing history, the works he produced became essential reading for scholars, clergy, and rulers throughout Europe. His impact was not immediate in the sense of public fame. Bede was a monk, not a king, but it was enduring, profound, and remarkably far-reaching. One of the most notable aspects of Bede's legacy is the circulation of his writings. Manuscripts of his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, along with his biblical commentaries, chronological tables, and scientific treatises, were copied and recopied by monks across the continent. This was a time when producing a single manuscript could take months, sometimes years, but Bede's texts spread widely, carried by traveling monks and envoys. His works became a cornerstone of European learning, used to teach history, theology, and practical ecclesiastical administration. In essence, Bede's ideas traveled farther than most kings, reaching audiences that he could never have imagined while sitting in candlelit solitude at Jarrow. Bede's influence on the study of history cannot be overstated. Before him, historical accounts were often fragmented, anecdotal, or heavily biased toward legend. Bede pioneered a systematic approach, emphasizing chronological order, careful source evaluation, and moral interpretation. Future historians look to him as a model of how to document events in a coherent, meaningful way. His approach influenced not just English historians, but scholars across the Carolingian Empire and beyond. Bede's work demonstrated that history could be both factual and didactic, showing that a careful chronicler could illuminate the past while teaching lessons for the present. Equally important was Bede's impact on education. His writings became standard texts in monastic schools and cathedral schools throughout medieval Europe. Monks and students studied his commentaries on scripture, his treatises on timekeeping, and his historical accounts. He taught by example, demonstrating intellectual rigor, clarity of thought, and a commitment to truth. For generations of learners, Bede's work represented a benchmark of scholarly excellence, precise, organized, and morally engaged. In a world where much knowledge was transmitted orally or through fragmented texts, his writings offered a consistent and reliable foundation for education. Bede's influence also helped shape English identity. By chronicling the history of the English people from Roman incursions to contemporary Northumbrian kings, he created a narrative that connected disparate kingdoms and communities. His work provided a sense of continuity, linking past, present, and future in a shared story of people and faith. This narrative not only informed how the English understood their own history, but also inspired later chroniclers, educators, and rulers to consider the importance of recording events systematically. Bede gave England a sense of coherence that had previously been missing, a framework that highlighted both unity and moral purpose. Canonization further cemented Bede's legacy. Though he lived a humble life in a remote monastery, he was eventually recognized as a saint and granted the title Venerable, a rare honor that acknowledged both his piety and his extraordinary scholarly contributions. This recognition was not merely ceremonial. It reflected the enduring value of his writings for the church, education, and European culture. Monks and clergy continued to study and circulate his works, ensuring that his influence extended far beyond his lifetime. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Bede's legacy is its longevity. Centuries after his death in 735 CE, scholars still referenced his texts. Renaissance humanists, medieval chroniclers, and early modern historians all looked to Bede for guidance on writing history, understanding chronology, and interpreting biblical texts. His methods of careful documentation and chronological structuring influenced the development of modern historiography. Bede demonstrated that even in a world without printing presses or mass communication, a committed scholar could shape knowledge and thought for generations. It's worth imagining the humor in this legacy. Bede wore a simple monk's robe, lived in a remote monastery, and likely never traveled far from his abbey. Yet his intellectual reach spanned hundreds of miles, across kingdoms and centuries. His manuscripts moved faster than any royal decree, reached more monasteries than armies, and educated more people than any king could hope to govern. He was, in many ways, the ultimate proof that brains and a quill could be more powerful than swords. Bede's combination of historical rigor, moral reflection, and scientific precision created a model for intellectual life in medieval Europe. He bridged the sacred and the secular, the scholarly and the practical, demonstrating that careful observation, disciplined work, and moral purpose could leave a lasting imprint on the world. While his contemporaries might have judged greatness by wealth or conquest, Bede achieved it through scholarship, meticulousness, and devotion, a reminder that influence is measured not only by power but by the ideas and knowledge one leaves behind. Bede the Venerable might have spent his life in the quiet solitude of Northumbrian monasteries, but his legacy has only grown louder through the centuries. Today he is celebrated not just as a medieval monk, but as England's first celebrity historian, a scholar whose life and works have shaped education, culture, and national identity. Modern audiences may not walk through abbeys reading manuscripts by candlelight, but Bede's influence persists in classrooms, libraries, and even popular media. One of the clearest ways Bede remains relevant today is through education. His Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum is still studied in schools and universities as a pioneering example of historical writing. Scholars admire the structure, methodology, and moral vision of his work, while students encounter him as the first historian to attempt a coherent narrative of England's past. In classrooms, teachers highlight how Bede merged historical fact with theological reflection, offering lessons on how societies record and interpret events. For many, Bede is the gateway to understanding early medieval England, not as a collection of myths and fragmented tales, but as a connected story shaped by faith, politics, and human ambition. Bede's cultural influence extends beyond academia. His life and writings have inspired books, articles, exhibitions, and even radio and television programming. In England, he is celebrated as a symbol of intellectual achievement, discipline, and the enduring power of scholarship. Statues, plaques, and commemorations mark his contributions to the understanding of England's early history. In many ways, Bede embodies the ideal of the scholar-monk whose work transcends time, providing not only information, but also a model of rigorous, morally grounded inquiry. Yet, like many historical figures, Bede is subject to simplifications, misquotes, and occasional humorous reinterpretations. In popular culture, his achievements are sometimes reduced to funny exaggerations. The monk who invented the calendar, the historian who knew everything about everyone in England, or the scholar who calculated Easter so many times he broke the moon's patience. While these depictions are playful, they reflect a genuine admiration for his meticulousness, creativity, and impact. Bede has become a cultural shorthand for scholarship, precision, and devotion, even if the nuance of his work is occasionally lost in translation. Modern historians also recognize Bede's role in shaping a sense of English identity. By chronicling the history of the English people, from Roman invasions to the early medieval kingdoms, he helped create a narrative of continuity and community. Today, Bede is often invoked in discussions of national heritage, the roots of English law and governance, and the development of a shared cultural memory. His work illustrates how history is not merely a record of events, but a tool for constructing collective identity. In other words, Bede didn't just write history, he helped write the story of a people. Interestingly, Bede's meticulous nature and devotion to counting, observing, and recording are now appreciated in a context that blends both admiration and humor. For example, when modern audiences learn that Bede calculated the date of Easter repeatedly, tracked lunar cycles, and chronicled events centuries old, they recognize his rigor and sometimes joke about how he would have thrived in the age of spreadsheets, Google Calendar, or statistical software. This playful framing humanizes him, making a 7th-8th century monk relatable to contemporary learners who might otherwise struggle to imagine life in a candle-lit scriptorium. Bede's global impact is notable as well. His works were disseminated across Europe, influencing not only English scholarship, but also continental medieval historiography. Monks, clerics, and educators in France, Germany, and Italy read and adapted his methodologies. Today, researchers still consult Bede to reconstruct early medieval Europe, to understand the spread of Christianity, and to study the interconnections of kingdoms long vanished. His approach, careful sourcing, chronological structure, and integration of moral interpretation remains a model for combining rigor and readability in historical writing. Finally, it's worth considering the enduring humor in Bede's legacy. While he never had the fame of kings, knights, or celebrities, his influence arguably surpasses theirs in intellectual terms. Modern fans of historical drama, literature, or educational media might imagine Bede as a kind of hidden star. He never got a movie series, one might joke, but if he did, he'd be the historical drama star who calculates Easter and writes history while everyone else binge-watches. The mental image is delightful. A monk, quill in hand, surrounded by manuscripts, narrating the triumphs and failures of early England, while viewers marvel at his brilliance, or try to understand why someone cares so much about lunar cycles. Bede's story is a reminder that intellectual achievement can endure across centuries, shaping culture, education, and national identity long after its creator has passed. From the quiet halls of Wearmouth Jarrow to classrooms, libraries, and scholarly conferences across the globe, Bede remains a model of diligence, curiosity, and devotion. He demonstrates that even a humble monk in a remote monastery can leave a legacy that is both serious and, occasionally, delightfully humorous.